Sung's return to the tower dungeon was preceded by a lot. There was a momentary truce between Beck and Choi. Beck would make a discovery beyond what we saw in the anime. Sung would find himself in debt hours after becoming an S rank. Then the ant here signifies a lot more trouble than you might think. There's also an additional reason for Sung's night watch, as well as other smaller details adding to the story. So, as promised, here's part 2 to everything the anime left out from Season 2, Episode 7. All the differences between the anime, manhwa, and web novel. But first, allow me to switch things over to the world of Haikyuu because today's sponsor comes in the form of a refreshingly new RPG plunging you right into it. This is Haikyuu Fly High, and it's a new stunning look every fan of the series shouldn't miss out on. How do you play? Well, you can handcraft your own all-star team from a roster of schools all across the Haikyuu-verse, utilize their unique attributes to outmaneuver and outplay the competition, recreate some of the most iconic moves like Hinata's Quick and Oikawa's Serve, then relive the full anime experience with authentic voiceovers from the original voice actors. It really is something to see these matches captured in 3D like this. Not only does it make the experience look a whole lot better, but you actually feel like you're down there part of the action. Like, with the way you can direct serves, blocks, and even the attacks itself, every point is sure to feel hard fought for, especially with certain duos unlocking powerful bond attributes. You can also enjoy a selection of mini-games too, so even if volleyball isn't what you're into, you can also indulge in base construction, trivia challenges, and training. There's a lot of other fun things to do aside from play matches. So, if you want to experience Haikyuu fully remastered the way that you want, be sure to pre-register for Haikyuu Fly High today. Just use my link down in the description, after which you'll get 25 recruit tickets and 800 diamonds. Now, to pick things up from where we left them, Sung's bout with the press had actually been interrupted by a call from Jinna. You'd think he wouldn't even notice here, but because he was concerned it might be an emergency, Sung answered right in front of everyone. It turns out it was just Jinna being curious as to what was going on. Reporters would then bombard Sung with question after question, leading him to get so annoyed that he was genuinely considering summoning shadows to clear a path for him. He believed Tank or Tusk might be the most appropriate. Now, it was in the anime that Beck would offer to help Sung get away from here, but what we didn't see was the underlying reason for that offer. It wasn't just Beck offering out of the goodness of his heart, but rather a clever plan developed between him and Choi. You see, since it wasn't just them that were aware of Sung's power anymore, both knew it was only a matter of time before the other S-rank guildmasters would come rushing in trying to recruit Sung themselves. That being the case, in order to avoid more competition and limit Sung only to themselves, Beck and Choi agreed to a truce of sorts. They decided they would pool their resources together, escort Sung back home privately, then use said time to discuss offers with him. At least that way it would keep the competition between the two of them. The reason either still believed they even had a chance to begin with was because to them a guild would always be absolutely necessary for him. It didn't matter what abilities he had, because at the end of the day, he wouldn't be able to tackle high-ranking dungeons without one. So it's for that reason Choi and Beck believed if they played their cards right, at least one of them could acquire Sung. That's when Beck would offer assistance, all with the approval of Choi behind him, promising to use their expertise to get Sung out of here. Sung could tell this wasn't an empty promise, but it was completely unnecessary given what we saw next. Now, if you're wondering how it was Beck was able to get an accurate read of Sung's power here, it was all because right as he was about to jump, Sung had released a good portion of the magical energy he'd been concealing. Though the moment was barely perceptible due to how brief it was, the incredible magic power Beck was exposed to caused him to activate his Eyes of the Beast ability instinctively. It was a special skill which allowed him to accurately read any person's power. He had done the same back at the Red Gate, and now his eyes were telling him Sung was stronger. So, where before Beck knew he could fight Sung, albeit at the cost of a limb or two, now Sung's power dwarfed him completely. His magic now was incomparably greater than his magic before. It was an observation which would lead him to the conclusion Sung could level up. This leads to a rather interesting cutscene with Beck later, since with this new information that Sung had grown stronger, he was now eager to learn everything he could about him. That being the case, Beck would lock himself into his office, then immediately start searching for everything he could on hunters who could grow stronger. It was the only thing he could do given his clues were limited. 3 hours would then be spent searching every resource available, including a special website only hunters of the highest rank had access to. As he expected though, not a single thing could be found on what he was looking for. It was a futile effort that led him to think maybe he was overreacting. Or maybe Sung just wasn't a hunter at all. With his existence defying every notion society had come to develop about hunters, Beck was starting to think perhaps Sung was just someone blessed by the gods. He truly had no idea what he was dealing with anymore. It was right as he was about to give up though that in a last-ditch effort, he would simply do the equivalent of googling hunter level up ability. At first, nothing in particular came up, but after 5 more pages of scrolling, an insignificant forum post would catch Beck's eye here. It was an anonymous post on a public hunter forum, one that read like this. Now, for those who watched my cut content from Season 1, Episode 3, you'd recognize this as the post Sung made back when he first got his abilities. So, what does Beck do now that he's stumbled upon it? Well, he would first call On since he knew this was something huge, then have him cross-reference the date of the post with what Sung was doing that day. It only took a few moments for On to search Sung's file, after which he would reveal Sung had woken up from the hospital that day. It was news that confirmed a non-zero chance of Sung being the one who made this post. So, Beck then went to investigate Sung's file himself, examining his hunter history in its entirety. What he noticed was a very peculiar change starting immediately after the Double Dungeon incident. To Beck, this was nothing more than a vague memory, but seeing it now did remind him he was actually present that day. He may not have known who Sung was back then, but what he did know was that from that point on, Sung was completely different. Like, where before all Sung did was help out in the lowest rank association raids, to start freelancing and even clear several C rank gates after, well, that clearly indicated something went to change him inside the Double Dungeon. It was a clear shift in hunter activity that implied this wasn't your typical reawakening. No. To Beck, this was a hunter who, in only a few months, grew from the E rank to the S rank. Still, there was no way to fully confirm whether this anonymous poster really was Sung, but if their words were to be believed and Sung's power grew the way the post described, then it was truly unfathomable how much stronger Sung could become. It was a revelation that led Beck to the conclusion recruiting Sung was impossible. He now finally understood why it was Sung was so disinterested with them. All it really came down to was a simple matter of why join a guild when you can easily create your own. I mean, with the power Sung had, it really was only a matter of time before his guild would become the best. So that for Beck was a truly disheartening thought to dwell on. Such a matter quickly became an afterthought though, because when Beck started to consider the true impact of a hunter who could grow infinitely stronger, he knew it was just a matter of time before the entire world would be focused on him. Forget the impact on the global hunter community as a whole, Sung's existence was sure to change the world as he knew it. So it was for that reason that Beck knew he needed to talk to Sung more than ever now. The thing is, if he wouldn't even talk to him for such ludicrous offers, then it was likely he wouldn't talk to him for anything else. The hardest part was for sure going to be getting face to face with him. On still hadn't yet given up on recruiting Sung himself though, so there was a funny scene in the manhwa where he was camped outside his apartment. Now, I can understand why the anime decided not to include all this, but it really does make Beck's knowledge so much more impactful. Like, where the anime kind of disregards what's probably the biggest revelation in hunter society ever, the novel portrays what I think is an accurate reaction to it. The way it loops back to an event all the way from the beginning of the series too, serves to make this scene so much more interesting. It also highlights just how insightful Beck really is. In any case, it's before we head back to the auction house that in the manhwa a panel would show Hwang Dong-soo's reaction to the news as well. He would see that Sung was still alive, and that would remind us the conflict with them is still ongoing. Now, the auction house contains one of the bigger portions of cut content from the episode, but it's also the least important. That being the case, rather than go through it detail by detail, I'm instead just gonna give you a more summarized version. So, Sung would take a taxi straight to the auction house from the press conference since clearing the tower dungeon was his #1 priority. It's here the taxi driver could tell that Sung was a hunter, so just like any normal person dealing with a hunter, he was extra careful when it came to Sung's mood. He didn't want to get on Sung's bad side since there were many hunters whose personalities could easily lead to incidents. Sung would just spend the duration of the ride on his phone, scrolling through social media to see his name was everywhere. It was pretty weird since this wasn't the same response when Cha got announced as an S rank 2 years ago. As it turns out, she was able to request that the association keep her details confidential. It was a privilege Sung could have asked for himself, but didn't end up doing since he didn't even know it was an option. That's why every reporter seemed to know all about him. They all had open access to his public hunter records. So, Sung would request for that confidentiality online, then call the auction house and prep them for the appraisal of an artifact they couldn't help but be suspicious of. In fact, if it hadn't been for Sung's newly announced S rank, any other hunter would have been laughed at and hung up on. So Sung knew this was the exact moment he got reevaluated for. It was also those at the auction house would have to take him seriously. Even then, the appraisers still didn't believe him because knowing what he knew about how artifacts were made, even the world's best forger using the best materials and putting their entire soul into it could at best make an artifact amplifying power by 50%. Such were the limits given even the most ideal circumstances. Since Sung was a premium client who was sure to have business with them in the future though, the appraiser decided to continue with his request anyway. It didn't matter how impossible it was for such an artifact to exist, they needed to oblige since Sung was an S rank. Now, the whole appraisal process was actually rather extensive, but to keep it brief, there were 2 ways that they tested it. First, they would use a B rank mage hunter as a base, get a numerical reading of his power before the orb, then have him hold the orb and take his reading again. This was to verify the orb did what Sung said, and it did in fact boost the hunter's base reading by 100%. Numbers were one thing, but to actually show that boost in action was another. So, with many clients preferring to see what the artifact they're buying does, the second stage of the assessment involved recording a physical test. The hunter would first activate a blizzard spell without the orb, then maintain the spell, pick up the orb, and display the results after. For this case in particular, the hunter had to cancel his spell almost immediately because to continue this enhanced blizzard would have frozen the entire room instantly. It had once again proven this was in fact the invaluable artifact Sung said it was. The orb actually had so much power that the moment the appraiser laid his hands on it, for the first time ever, he wanted to try and steal it. Had it not been an S-rank hunter providing it to him, then there was a good chance he actually might have tried to. In any case, the appraiser was eager to at least proceed with the sale since the 5% commission on it was sure to make him and the others rich. Sung first asked to peruse the artifacts they had to buy though, since he wanted to make sure that they had what he needed. As it turns out, the type he was looking for was actually one of the most common out there. He just couldn't find it online due to how expensive they were. So in the end, Sung would be able to buy the artifacts without needing to sell anything. He just needed to use his own daggers as collateral, then take out a small loan from the auction house. It's pretty funny since Sung hasn't even been an S rank for an entire day, yet somehow he's already found himself in debt. It's back home that Sung would find reporters everywhere, but Jinna would prevent him from doing anything about it. As much as he wanted to have them leave, Jinna wouldn't allow it since Sung was already getting hate online. The public didn't really like the way Sung disregarded the reporters at the first press conference, and now he was getting heat for being a bit arrogant. Luckily, this attention wasn't gonna last for much longer, since as soon as Sung's request for confidentiality was processed, the reporters would get word to stay away from Sung. So really, this was nothing but a temporary problem. Fast forward to when Sung is setting up the Night Watch, and this would actually be something he did earlier on in the novel. It was after he'd just met with the chairman that Sung would come home to find his neighborhood way too dark. It's then that he would remember a case of ongoing serial murders, some of which were happening nearby. Since the victims of those were all women, it was here that Sung decided he should set something up to protect Jinna. She did frequent these roads late at night herself, so there was a good chance that she could become a target. Of course, he personally couldn't just sit around and guard her, so that's when Sung came up with the idea to have patrols. It was also he could keep Jinna safe from any potential serial killers. He also believed it was his way of giving back to the community. So, with a great sense of satisfaction, Sung couldn't help but smirk at the idea of providing S-rank defense services for free. If anyone found out that that was the case, then he was sure the value of his entire neighborhood would skyrocket. As for the soldiers protecting Jinna personally, they were strong enough to handle up to an A-rank hunter. So, unless the killer was a high-ranked hunter himself, Jinna was sure to be safe from pretty much everything. Now, there's two more important things I want to cover before getting to the tower dungeon, and the first is Mr. Yu's eternal slumber. This was a death sentence in more ways than one, since not only did the eternal slumber eventually put you into a coma-like state indefinitely, it also drained a person's life force away. Unless the afflicted was hooked up to one of these magic life support machines, the disease would without fail eventually kill them. So it was before these machines had been discovered that the eternal slumber was 100% fatal. It probably still was, considering that not a single person had ever woken up from it. This would lead the doctor to make the absurd suggestion of never seeing Jinho again, but that was a burden Mr. Yu wasn't willing to put on Jinho. As a father who cared deeply for his family, he would never want to impede his son's life that way. Plus, with more and more hunters being born every day, as well as mana becoming more commonplace in everyday appliances, Mr. Yu knew his exposure to magic was going to increase no matter what. So, with society moving forward and him being left behind, what this was simply natural selection. To Mr. Yu, it felt like he was being culled. Even so, that still wasn't enough to make him give up yet. As someone who was never the victim and never lost, this was simply another challenge for him to overcome. It was no different from any of the others in his life. Well, at least that's how he wanted to feel anyway. Now, the other important scene I wanted to cover was this right here involving the ant. This was a remote island off the coast of Japan, and these two were the only two hunters on it. As a low D and E rank, their jobs weren't to fight in gates and clear them, but was instead to make the rounds, talk to the community, and find out if there was a gate. It was of the utmost importance to locate them as fast as possible. Should one remain hidden and lead to a dungeon break, then every resident of the island was sure to be killed from it. That being the case, both these hunters were well aware of what was at stake here. It's for that reason they would make their rounds every single day, talk to the residents to see if they saw anything, then use a manometer to determine if there were any changes in magical energy. It's once a gate was found that hunters from the outside would have to be contacted, after which it would take 3 days for them to get organized and get here. So, with 3 days being the time it took to get ready, that meant these two needed to find the gate within 3 days of its appearance. It was their responsibility as the only two hunters present. Well, it was up until this moment. To finally switch things over to the tower dungeon now, that's when the story starts to get back on pace again. Not too much was different, but there are a few details worth mentioning. Like, Sung was happy to be back at a place where he could cut loose without worry, but the difficulty was going to increase exponentially from here. His new quest filled him with excitement, since with each of his other class skills being indispensable, there was no doubt that this new one would be too. In the manhwa, Tusk looked absolutely incredible, and his attack had killed enough high-ranking demons to level up Sung twice. So his stats were sitting pretty now at this. And with his intelligence almost at the 200 mark, that brought his MP to over 5,000 now. I know that may seem like a lot compared to what it was before, but with the way his skills were improving, Sung knew he'd need a whole lot more. Like, if he wanted to infinitely revive the number of soldiers he was expecting to have later on, 5,000 mana certainly wasn't going to cut it. Plus, with intelligence being the only way to improve his class skills, more mana was simply a byproduct of improving that. As he was now though, he was capable of extracting up to 820 shadows at any given time, but only allowed to store 155 of them. His current army consisted of 127. Unfortunately, the Orb of Avarice did nothing to improve those, so that's why Sung felt it was better in Tusk's hands. Now, Sung wasn't the only one leveling up here, as with each passing day, his soldiers grew stronger too. In fact, a Shadow-like tank had leveled up 10 times already. It and the others were leveling up faster than he was. Getting to floor 80 was pretty smooth sailing, but it's after that that things started to get a bit tricky. that's where I'm gonna end things off, so next episode I'm sure we'll get to cover the rest of the tower dungeon. That and, you know, the true best girl of solo leveling. So let me know what you thought down in the comments, and if you liked the video then leave a like and consider subscribing. Until next time though, ciao!